Okay, are we getting into it here, or is this? Are we?
Yeah, yeah, it's coming in.
Yeah, but like, are we starting the seminar now, or?
No, I just started recording.
Okay, just so we have like.
Start whenever you want.
All right. How do I just alt tab over to the?
Okay. You
Yeah,
can alt
sure.
tab if you want, but I usually just do this.
Okay.
It's down there.
Yeah, we can pause the. All right. So how do I switch then? Like, you just gesture.
It's a three-finger gesture.
Three
Yeah.
finger.
The other
Oh,
way.
okay. Yeah.
There we go.
All right. Cool. Oh, are we starting then?
If you're ready.
Well, actually, just in the meantime, I want to do this for. Actually, I thought about this during your seminar. Just as a quick survey here. Who here actually is familiar with SAS as a genre? All right. 3 people. That's more than I. That's pretty good. Do you want to get into it then, or yeah, you can.
If everybody's ready and you're ready, go for it.
All right. So SAS is a subgenre of punk. I wouldn't necessarily call it insular, but it can be rather opaque, especially in regards to like why it sounds the way it does. So I kind of want to start us off with a bit of a motivating example. So as we go through the history, we like know what we're building up to. Before that, I'm going to give a definition. Of course, there's no hard and fast rules when it comes to genre, but just meant more than anything as a listening guide. In that respect, SAS is a subgenre of hardcore punk, somewhere usually in the post-hardcore to screamo area, which is based on incorporating angular riffs, dance rhythms, and these flamboyant, kind of sassy vocals. So when we're listening to our first example here, these are kind of the characteristics you should have in mind. We're going to be listening to a song by Terrifying Girls High School. I've chosen a pretty recent one so we can kind of come full circle as we. Right, I got it. So we can kind of come full circle as we go through the examples. Is that you or? Okay. All right. There we go. Oh, hang on, it didn't. What is that? Okay. It's. I hit the space bar. All right. So now that we know what we're getting ourselves into, let's kind of look at where the genre started. So it really started in the 90s hardcore punk scene. So as punk moved into the 90s, the music became increasingly aggressive, and with that came this kind of general bias towards masculinity and to some degree ostensibly away from the progressive ideas it was really meant to espouse. A good case study of this is the straight edge movement. So for those of you who don't know, that was, or I guess technically still is, a movement based around like abstaining from drugs and casual sex, and it was kind of meant to protect its followers from the rampant drug abuse at the time. But it kind of there's definitely big portions of it which spiraled into this kind of reactionary pseudo Christian base. And while the straight edge scene had been existed for a while, it was in the 90s where it really took off. And then, of course, there's going to be bands who are interested in playing this kind of sound at the time without necessarily participating in these kind of values, and that's where the ideas of Sass first came from. So the Nation of Ulysses are widely considered to be like the first band of playing into these kind of ideas that would go on to become Sass. And they particularly developed a lot of the aesthetics and kind of presentation that would become popular in the genre. But the thing is, musically, they did definitely, there is some characteristics, especially with regard to the vocal styles, but overall, you don't necessarily see a lot of those ideas. And so we're going to go ahead and move on to our next band, Brainiac. Brainiac were another kind of like proto-Sass band with a similar ideology. But they were the first to really start like developing the building blocks of the sound. They show a lot of flexibility with their vocals, not always being sassy, but a lot of times going into that kind of sassy territory. And like you'll see too this general kind of like rebellion against norms in the scene, especially with like the guitar part in the song, which is kind of takes the angularity that was common in post-hardcore and just ramps it up to kind of a ridiculous extreme, you'll see. Yeah. All right. So Brainiac released their albums between 93 and 97, And as you go through the 90s, you see more and more bands kind of playing with and building on these ideas. Bands like Liars, The Dismemberment Plan, and Q and Not You, who we're going to talk about here. Their first album, No Kill, No Beep Beep, released in 2000, is really, like you see, like once we go into the 2000s, it's really on the edge of where we'd expect a proper Sass album to be. The vocals are tonally about where you'd expect. Instrumentally, they're incorporating a lot of the right ideas, that kind of angularity, the danciness. At this point, all we're really missing is like the aggression we're going to see with the actual main scene later on. Unfortunately, after this, they did kind of move away into a more standard dance punk style, but still, it's a good example to see like how far the genre had developed at this sound at this point. Responding. And that's okay. All right, I guess the slideshow over then here. All right. All right, yeah, no worries. I guess I'll talk here while waiting. So like once we get to the mid 2000s, really see the sound kind of come into its own, thanks to mainly thanks to the bands we're gonna kind of work through here. It goes through its final stages, like borrowing from the screamo scene, which at this time was kind of coming into its own with bands like Gospel and City of Caterpillar putting out their big albums. And with that developed sound, we see it pick up momentum to the point where it starts getting attention in the mainstream, which we'll kind of talk about more on a case by case basis when I get there. But you definitely see the number of bands in the sound grow to the point where it starts having its own dedicated record labels. Sound Virus was the main one. Pretty much every big SAS band had a release on Sound Virus. But you also have some other smaller ones too. Ones like Gravity, 31G, Goaltender Laboratories, and Discord also frequently hosting SAS bands. And at this point, we start to see the scene kind of taking on the characteristics that it was ostensibly meant to since its inception, with this constant subversion of the more masculine presentation of hardcore kind of paying off with an audience that was much more diverse in terms of like sexuality and gender and all that good stuff. So, the main SAS band of the time was the Blood Brothers. They actually started out in '97, closer to like the proto-SAS era, putting out an EP and a couple of albums during that time. And even those, you see them kind of push the aggression, borrowing a lot from that screamo scene in the way that I mentioned before. But their first couple of releases, they weren't necessarily bad, but they were pretty straightforward a lot of the times. But it's with their third album, Burn Piano Island Burn, where they really start to pick up momentum. Like on this album, they kind of stretch the songwriting, start to kind of make something out of those building blocks that we've seen developed here. And because of that, this album was a lot more successful than the previous two. The point it was getting reviews in all the mainstream music review places and that kind of thing. And because of that, it ended up kind of serving in a lot of ways to codify the genre. And this album and the Blood Brothers in general really did kind of serve as a model for a lot of the SAS bands of this period, to the point where we're not necessarily going to talk about a lot of just the general parts of the scene, because so much of them are just modeled directly after this album, as I'll kind of show off in a case example. But yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's 5 of them. They're just composited in like there's like 4 groups. Yeah, it's not like a 30-person band. That'd be pretty cool though. Yeah, if you see, you can see the same people in multiple spots. Yeah. Yeah, it's worth going over like their other major albums from this time. We have Crimes, which showed off their sound. It kind of worked in a bit more direct context, but still with the same ideas. And this ended up scoring them like a performance on like a late night TV show, one of those like talk shows. They have a band at the end, that kind of thing. So like they were touring this stuff on like live TV. And their last album, Young Machetes, it kind of went for a more artsy sound. It drew some criticism at the time, but I personally think it's their best album. But if you're like new to this genre, these 3 albums are really the best place to start, just listening to these 3 albums front to back. So I'm going to show off a song from one of their albums, and then we'll take a brief listen to like just another just standard band from the time, so you can kind of compare how close a lot of the style is. So we'll look forward to that here. All right, and then for this next one, we'll just play a little bit from the middle, but like, so the sound wise, it's a little more straightforward than the Blood Brothers example, but you'll hear in terms of like the vocal style and even a lot of the way they incorporate the kind of dancer elements, how close it is in the sound. If we're gonna, all right, there we go. So the next band we're going to talk about from this era is Death from Above 1979. They're a two-piece band from Toronto. They ended up being very influential on the dance punk scene. We only were able to briefly mention kind of the fashion of the time, but they were very influential to like the fashion. They kind of pioneered the whole fuckboy aesthetic, you can see. But more notably, they were also the other sass band that really got a lot of mainstream attention. Going over their discography, they only really have two main releases in this time. They have an EP called Heads Up, which we'll listen to a song from. This played more into the mainstream sass sound. The vocals are a bit tamer than the Blood Brothers, and obviously they're working within their limits as a two-piece band. But other than that, it's very much a standard sass kind of sound they have going on. They only had one album from this time called You're a Woman, I'm a Machine. This album was meant to market sass to kind of like a wider audience, to the point where it's really kind of on the edge of being sass or not. The vocals are very tame by sass standards, and it really exists more in like the dance punk space than anything, although to be fair, it is still a lot more aggressive than standard dance punk. But this album brought a lot of attention to the scene, it brought a lot of acclaim too. It had music videos in rotation on MTV, another one of those like late night performances we alluded to before. So I thought we listen to a song from the EP, and then just to kind of highlight the sassiness, I went with a live performance from a song from one of the albums. We'll just listen to a brief part of it because it's pretty long, but yeah. Yeah, and so the excerpt we'll listen to here is from a live performance from pretty recently, actually. I chose this one because it really brings out a lot of the kind of sassy characteristics of the song, which, for those curious, is romantic rights. Oh yeah, flashing lights warning for this. All right, so with that, there's one more band I want to talk about. Okay. It's So Black Eyes never got the mainstream attention at the time of the other two bands, but in retrospective, they're widely considered one of the best sass bands, and I think like in modern metrics on like streaming services, they're one of the most popular. They only have actually one proper sass album, their self-titled album. It's kind of interesting because it's based on more of a no-wave foundation than the other albums we've looked at so far. And as a quick disclaimer, the song we're going to be listening to is one of the like slower songs off the album. I chose it because it's the most popular song off the album by far. But just so you know, if it doesn't seem to quite match the energy of the two tracks, it's because that's why it does. This album does match energy overall quite the same. I did have to be perfectly. All right, so now we're going to look at the genres that the scene went on to influence during the time. The first one we got to talk about is the white belt scene. White belt is a subgenre of like grindcore, mathcore in that area that developed kind of in parallel actually to Sasscore with a similar basis in terms of its philosophy, aesthetics, and ostensibly its genre stylings. Although with a grind base, its those kind of characteristics aren't necessarily going to come through as clearly. And white belt never got the mainstream attention of Sass, of course, but once you get to the later 2000s, we have the whole MySpace scene pop up. There's a lot of like smaller kind of communities of genres that kind of flourished on there, and white belt very much was one of those. There's a lot of like just like basement recordings and that kind of like lesser those smaller recordings you get with like extreme genres. And because of that, it's very well archived online as opposed to a lot of the more mainstream Sass stuff. And so there isn't clearly is I should mention too there isn't necessarily a clear line between Sasscore and white belt, and to the point where during the original era it didn't seem like there was much of a distinction made. There is one oftentimes now, and we'll get to why later on. But the band pictured here is the Sawtooth Grin. I thought we'd listen to one of those songs just to kind of compare and contrast their sounds. Yeah, so as I said, there wasn't originally kind of a distinction made between two genres. So if you go on a lot of sites, it'll just list white belt and Sass bands as being the same genre. So I mean, you can tell me whether or not you agree with that. But going on to the influence on more mainstream genres. First off, we have the dance punk of the 2000s. So, as a reminder, dance punk had its first big wave in the 80s with this very heavy kind of disco funk influence sound. But when it resurged in the 2000s, a lot of it was shaped by Sass. Like, a lot of the prominent dance punk bands at the time were originally Sass bands. Like, for example, you've got bands like Hot Hot Heat and The Rapture, and we previously mentioned Q and Not You and Death from Above 1979 are often considered a dance punk band. And even more were on Sass labels. Like, for example, we have a very prominent dance punk band from the time whose name is literally three exclamation marks. And they actually started on Gold Standard Laboratories. And of course, they would go on to be influential on the whole post-punk revival scene. At that point, there's not really much of the sound left, to be fair, but it's worth noting as just kind of a chain of events. But as a more direct sonic influence, we have the post-hardcore scene of the 2000s, which was kind of coming into its own in the mainstream at the time. And if you look at the key bands of the scene, like, I mean, the main band like we have here is At the Drive-In. Their last album, Relationship of Command, came out in 2000. That basically started the mainstream kind of post-hardcore scene. And they have literally directly cited Brainiac as an influence, not only on themselves, but as a scene as a whole. And also, I found this out while researching, but the guitarist, Omar Rodriguez Lopez, actually co-owned Gold Standard Laboratories during the like peak of Sass, starting in like 2003, I think. And I mean, like the other big post-hardcore band from this time is Glassjaw. The lead singer of that was literally in a Sass band called Head Automatica. If the vocal style of Glassjaw itself isn't enough to convince you they're influenced by Sass. As a kind of good case study, though, we have the band The Fall of Troy. They were another very popular post-hardcore band at the time. I mean, like they got into Guitar Heroes, which by 2005 standards, that's how you know you've made it. Now, if you're familiar with this album, like the most popular songs are songs like FCP Remix, where you might not hear a lot of the influence, but this album is actually a very good case study because as you go deeper and deeper into the album, you see more and more of that Sass influence seep in. And of course, this album and Fall of Troy would go on to be very influential on the whole swancore scene. Bands like Dance Gavin Dance and Saucian for anyone who's into those. But yeah, I've got a song here from this album. We won't listen to the full thing because it's a Fall of Troy song, but it kind of falls apart at the bridge. But at the first part, the Sass sound should be very undeniable to the point where it's kind of on the bridge of being a Sass song itself. You should hear. Now, of course, they go on to do some more standard like swancore stuff, but hopefully you can hear from that clip what's happening. And so then after, like, by the late 2000s into the 2010s, the Sass scene had kind of collapsed. I don't even have like a slide for it because I didn't see any big like cause for it. Like the Blood Brothers broke up in 2007, hitting a creative wall. Death from Above broke up in 2006 over internal conflict. And it just seemed to be that kind of energy propagating through the scene. But in recent times, there very much has been a resurgence of interest in Sass. This can be largely attributed to the band See You Space Cowboy, pictured here. They started out in 2016 and very deliberately marketed themselves as like a MySpace-style white belt band. As I mentioned before, the distinction between white belt wasn't originally seen. It's thanks to them that we actually have that distinction made now. And I mean, with this too, See You Space Cowboy got a lot of attention too in the whole metalcore, grindcore scene. And with that, we've seen like a lot of old Sass bands getting back together too. Like the Blood Brothers retoured a little while ago. Black Eyes are back together. I mean, Death from Above have been back together since 2011, but their latest album, they've started kind of playing back into that Sass sound. And we also see a lot of newer bands kind of interested in playing that Sass sound too, which sorry I said we go full circle. So our last song is going to be from an EP which actually came out this year, this July, by a band called Circuit Circuit. So hopefully now we have the context to properly enjoy this song, and this will be the end of the seminar with this song here. Do we have any questions then? Or? Oh yeah, okay. Swancore is like a subgenre of post-hardcore developed in like the late 2000s. It was very heavily incorporated like a lot of progressive rock influence and like very kind of arpeggio based in the sound. Like if you think of like a lot of like what Fall of Troy and like Anthony Green were doing, and later on that influenced the whole like Dance Gavin Dance and those kind of bands. That's Swancore. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Oh, yes, Orchid. So Orchid started out like two albums as very, I guess they're more technically, those would be like what's called emo violence or whatever, but their third album, they very heavily kind of, they started playing into that sass sound and that, yeah. Any other questions or? Yeah. So I actually looked online as hard as I could. The earliest examples I saw were in reference to the Blood Brothers album Burn Panel Island Burn, but they were all using the term like with the assumption that the listener would already be familiar with it. So somewhere offline pre 2004. So yeah. Oh, you're it's fine if you want to give a half question or something. Yeah. Probably Young Machetes, like I said. I list. Yeah.
Obviously, you mentioned how Sasscore is making a comeback, but is it like is it talked about online, or is it still sort of fairly like underground?
I mean, it's definitely not as popular as the mid 2000s, but like
Diamond in the rough.
you see, like in the period of like 2009 to like 2015, there was basically nothing in terms of sass. And if you look on like Bandcamp, that you see a lot of that interest kind of picking back up. It's not ever getting the mainstream attention it did, but it's like there are people writing it again is kind of the idea. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I do. I mean, I think Death from Above 1979 makes better music, so that's. So Death from Above 1979, like with their EP and that, they originally called themselves Death from Above, and of course, like James Murphy from LCD Sound System has his record label called Death from Above, and so they sued the band, so they added on 1979 to make their names distinct. Not, I don't know. They said those with the least number of numbers they had to add to their name to not get sued. That's what I saw. So anything. Yes, I do. Yeah. I mean, I didn't get much of a chance to talk about them, but there were definitely a lot of like early sass bands who were playing into the no wave sound. Like there's Arab on Radar and there's X Models. A lot of those early sass bands. There were some that were definitely playing with those sounds, so you could draw an ancestral connection there. Any other questions? All right. Yeah, the projector's coming up, so it's.
That's not. You can feel free to ask questions again.
I think we're all good though.